The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the sleek marble floors of Kingsley Enterprises. Employees shuffled past, eyes fixed on their screens, typing furiously, oblivious to the storm about to erupt in the CEO's office. David Carter stood stiffly in front of the massive oak desk, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. He had dedicated a decade of his life to this company, working long nights, sacrificing weekends, missing birthdays and anniversaries, all to ensure its success. Yet here he was, standing before Mark Kingsley, the man who had built his empire, on the backs of employees like him, with an expression of bored indifference. "I don't care about your excuses," Mark sneered, tossing a thick file onto the desk without bothering to open it. "You're fired." The words hit David like a physical blow. His mouth went dry, his heartbeat a deafening drum in his ears. "Fired?" His voice cracked slightly, but he straightened his spine, refusing to crumble. "Mark, I've given everything to this company. There must be some mistake." Mark leaned back in his leather chair, an amused smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Mistake? The only mistake was keeping you around this long." He gestured lazily toward the file. "Your performance has been unimpressive. Frankly, I don't need dead weight dragging my company down." A bitter laugh bubbled up in David's throat, but he swallowed it down. He had been instrumental in securing the biggest deals the company had ever seen. He had trained half of the executives sitting in the boardroom. He had done everything right, and now he was being discarded like garbage. "This is personal," David said, his voice dangerously low. "I know it is. I deserve to know why." Mark's smirk widened as he stood buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. "You want to know why?" He stepped closer, his voice a mocking whisper. "Because I can. Because people like you don't belong in my world. You were always just a janitor who got lucky." His tone dripped with contempt. "Did you really think you could climb higher than you were meant to? That I would ever let someone like you sit at my table?" David's stomach twisted. He had worked his way up from cleaning the hallways of this building to running multi-million-dollar projects. He had earned his place, but in Mark's eyes, he would never be more than the man who once scrubbed floors. "You're a fraud," Mark continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "A pathetic charity case I should have gotten rid of years ago." The room was deathly silent. The air felt thick, suffocating. David clenched his jaw so hard it ached. He wanted to scream, to demand justice, but he saw it in Mark's eyes, the ruthless amusement, the cruel satisfaction of watching a man break. Security stepped forward before David could speak. Two men in dark suits loomed beside him, waiting for the order. Mark picked up David's company badge and flicked it onto the floor like a discarded piece of trash. "Escort this man out," Mark said coolly. David stared at the badge lying at his feet. 10 years of his life, 10 years of loyalty, hard work, and sacrifice, reduced to nothing in the space of a single breath. He bent down, slowly, deliberately, and picked up the badge, turning it over in his hand one last time. Then he met Mark's gaze, his expression eerily calm. "You'll regret this," Mark laughed. "Doubt it." David didn't resist as security grabbed his arms, leading him through the office. The whispers started immediately. Colleagues who had once praised him now avoided his eyes. Some even smirked, feeding off the humiliation like vultures circling a dying animal. As he was shoved out the front doors and onto the cold pavement, a gust of wind stung his face. The city lights blurred before him, but not from tears. He refused to cry. No, he would not break. Mark thought this was the end of the story, but it was only the beginning. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking through David's thin jacket as he sat on a cold, cracked bench in the heart of the city. His fingers, numb from the chill, gripped the last few dollars he had left. A week ago he had a career, an apartment, a future. Now he had nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitterness of betrayal burning in his chest. He had tried to fight it at first, convinced that someone in the company would step up for him, that an ally would emerge. But the calls went unanswered. His emails were ignored. Even the colleagues who once called him a friend suddenly vanished, afraid to be associated with a man Mark Kingsley had cast out. He knocked on doors, reached out to contacts, but every opportunity slammed shut before he could step through. Mark had made sure of that. Days passed, then weeks. His savings dwindled until there was nothing left. His landlord gave him a single, cold glance before sliding an eviction notice under his door. With no job and no way to pay rent, he had no choice but to pack a single bag and walk away from the life he had built. The city, once familiar and welcoming, became a battlefield of survival. Job applications led nowhere. Every rejection stung, each one a reminder of how quickly his world had crumbled. He tried to find shelter where he could, sleeping in train stations, abandoned buildings, anywhere that offered even the slightest protection from the elements. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a dull, constant ache that became as familiar as the sound of traffic. He learned which cafes would let him sit without buying anything and which restaurants threw out food that was still edible. But the worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold, it was the isolation. People he had known for years passed him on the street without a second glance. Friends he had helped in their lowest moments suddenly had no time for him. The city was full of people, yet he had never felt more alone. And all the while, Mark thrived. His name flashed across business magazines, announcing another record-breaking quarter. His smug face appeared on television interviews, talking about leadership and success. David saw him once, stepping out of a sleek black car in front of a five-star restaurant, laughing with executives who had once shaken David's hand and called him brilliant. That night, as he sat under the awning of a closed bookstore, shielding himself from the rain, something shifted inside him. The pain, the humiliation, the anger. It no longer crushed him. It fueled him. He refused to be a casualty of Mark's arrogance. If no one would give him a chance, he would make his own. With whatever loose change he had left, he bought an old, second-hand business book from a street vendor. Every night, under the dim glow of streetlights, he read. He studied market trends, investment strategies, corporate structures. He analyzed Mark's company, dissecting every decision, every flaw. During the day, he wandered through offices, pretending to be a potential client, listening to how deals were made. He struck up conversations with strangers, learning from every interaction. He absorbed knowledge like a sponge, sharpening his mind while his body withered. The hunger, the cold, the exhaustion, they became background noise. His focus was singular. He would rise again, and when he did, he wouldn't just take back what was his. He would take everything. The city hadn't changed, but David had. The desperation that once gripped him had transformed into something sharper, something unstoppable. Every night spent under flickering streetlights, every meal he went without, had hardened him. He no longer saw himself as the man who had been thrown away. He saw himself as the man who would return, not as an underdog, but as a force to be reckoned with. Opportunities didn't come knocking. He built them himself. He started small, offering insights to struggling businesses, making connections with people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. At first, no one took him seriously. He was just another nameless man with nowhere to go. But then his advice started working. A struggling restaurant suddenly saw profits climb. A near-bankrupt supplier secured a deal that pulled them back from the brink. Word spread, and slowly, people started seeking him out. With every deal, he gained leverage. With every connection, he built a foundation. He never asked for much, just a small percentage, a favor owed in return. It was never about money in the beginning. It was about power, about putting the right pieces in place. The first time he sat in a high-rise office again, it wasn't as an employee. It was as an advisor, quietly guiding decisions from the shadows. He learned to speak the language of power, to move through rooms without being seen until it was too late. And all the while, Mark remained oblivious. He still sat at the head of his empire, arrogant and untouchable, unaware that the cracks were already forming beneath him. He still laughed at parties, still signed contracts with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. But David was there, always watching, always listening. He learned Mark's weaknesses, his blind spots. He learned who trusted him, who secretly despised him. He found the men who had been crushed under Mark's boot, men who carried grudges, like fire in their veins. One by one, David turned them into allies. Then, the first real shift happened. A competitor emerged, an anonymous investor offering better deals, undercutting Mark's firm in ways he couldn't counter. At first, Mark dismissed it, a minor inconvenience, nothing more. Then it happened again and again. Clients started pulling away, whispering about new opportunities, about a smarter player in the game. The losses were small at first, barely noticeable, but they added up. His board members grew uneasy. Reports landed on his desk about sudden market shifts, about contracts slipping through his fingers. Still, he didn't know who was behind it until the name appeared. Mark sat in his office, fingers tapping anxiously against the polished mahogany desk. The walls around him, once a symbol of his untouchable status, felt smaller now, closing in with every passing second. Another email had arrived, another client, pulling out. The numbers were clear. His empire was crumbling and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had tried everything. He had called in favors, tried to renegotiate contracts, even attempted to strong-arm his way back into deals that had once been guaranteed, but no one was listening. His competitors had become too powerful, too well-connected. Every door that had once opened for him was now locked shut. And the worst part? It all led back to one name, David Carter. The realization had hit him like ice in his veins. The man he had humiliated, discarded like trash, had come back. And he hadn't just come back. He had orchestrated Mark's downfall with the patience of a man who knew the game better than anyone. A knock at the door made Mark jolt. His secretary stepped in, her face unreadable. "Mr. Carter is here to see you," she said. For a moment Mark couldn't breathe. Then, before he could even formulate a response, the door opened. David walked in, calm, composed, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had already won. He didn't look angry. He didn't look vengeful. He just looked amused. Mark shot to his feet, trying to regain some control. "David," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We were friends, right?" David tilted his head, considering the words as if they were some foreign concept. Then he leaned back, smiling coldly. "Friends?" His voice was smooth, measured. "Funny, I don't remember friends throwing each other into the dirt." Mark swallowed hard. "Look, I know things got out of hand, but this doesn't have to go any further." His voice wavered. "Maybe we can work something out." David let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Mark, this was never about working something out. You took everything from me. You laughed while you did it. And now, you want mercy?" Mark's face twisted with frustration, with panic. "It was just business," he spat. David's expression didn't change. So is this. Silence hung between them. Mark had always been the one in control, the one dictating the terms. But now, standing before David, he saw it in his eyes. The sheer, unshakable certainty that there was no way out. David sighed, glancing around the office. "I'll be taking this building, by the way," he said casually. "And the company. You'll find the paperwork on your desk. It's all quite legal. A few strategic acquisitions you never even noticed until it was too late." He met Mark's eyes again. "That's the difference between us. You built your empire on arrogance. I built mine on patience." Mark's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Everything he had, everything he had spent his life creating, was gone. And the man he had tried to destroy was now standing in front of him, holding all the power. David turned, heading for the door. Then, as if remembering something, he paused. He reached into his pocket, pulled out something small, and flicked it onto Mark's desk. A company ID badge. Mark stared at it, his breath coming in shallow gasps. It was his own badge. David smiled. "Security," he called toward the hallway. "Please escort this man out." And just like that, it was over. Mark barely registered the sound of the security guard stepping into the office. His mind was spinning, his chest tightening as reality crashed down on him. Everything he had built, every ounce of power he once held, was gone. And the man he had dismissed as nothing more than a worthless janitor now owned everything. David stood at the door, watching with an almost bored expression as the guards flanked Mark. They didn't touch him, not yet, waiting for him to move. On his own, the humiliation burned worse than any physical blow ever could. "This is a mistake," Mark blurted out, his voice raw with desperation. "You need me, David. You don't know how to run this company. You don't have the experience, the connections." David let out a soft chuckle. "I have all the connections I need," he said. "And experience? You're right. I didn't have it before, but I learned. While you were too busy sitting in this office thinking you were untouchable, I was preparing for this moment." Mark shook his head violently. "You can't do this. I built this company from the ground up." David's gaze hardened. "And yet you destroyed people like they were nothing, tossed them aside without a second thought. I was one of them. But the difference between you and me, Mark, is that I remember every single person who helped me, every person who stood by me, and every person who tried to break me." Mark's hands clenched into fists. His mind scrambled for something, anything, to turn this around. But there was nothing. His bank accounts had been drained by lawsuits and failing investments. His reputation was in shambles. The board members who once praised him had abandoned him the moment they saw the company slipping away. He had always believed he was untouchable, that no one could ever bring him down. But now, standing in the office that was no longer his, facing the man he had wronged, he finally understood. His downfall wasn't because of David, it was because of himself. The guards stepped forward. One gestured toward the door. "Sir," he said firmly, "it's time to leave." Mark looked around wildly, as if expecting someone to step in, to stop this from happening. But there was no one left. His allies had vanished. His power had crumbled. He was alone. David stepped aside, giving Mark one last path out. "Take what dignity you have left," he said quietly, "and walk out on your own." Mark swallowed hard, his pride warring with the crushing weight of defeat. He took one shaky step forward, then another. The guards followed, but they didn't need to touch him. The former CEO of the company walked himself out. As he stepped into the hallway, heads turned. Employees who once cowered under his rule now watched in stunned silence. Some whispered, some smirked, some simply stood, arms crossed, waiting to see him go. It was a walk of shame unlike any other. When the elevator doors slid open, Mark turned one last time. His gaze met David's, but there was no malice there, no anger, just finality. David gave a small nod. Then the door shut, and Mark was gone. David exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in. He had done what he set out to do, not with reckless revenge, but with patience, with strategy, with the kind of justice that didn't need violence, only the truth. And in the end, the truth had been enough. Life has a way of balancing the scales, and sometimes karma delivers justice in the most unexpected ways. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone who did wrong eventually faced the consequences of their actions? Maybe it was a boss who mistreated employees, only to lose everything, or someone who underestimated another, only to watch them rise to success. Stories like these remind us that what goes around truly does come around. If you've ever seen real-life karma in action, share your experience in the comments. Your story might just be the inspiration someone else needs to believe in justice.